Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about some buried Confederate gold in Vermont. Yeah, you heard that right. Confederate gold in Vermont. So there is obviously a good story to this one, and we're going to go over that. So most people think of the Civil War in the U.S. as taking place in states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, South Carolina, places like that. And granted, most of the battles and the epicenter of the war were in these places between 1861 and 1865 when the war got over. But most would think New England was pretty sheltered from the conflicts going on further south. And for the most part, they would be right. But one thing most people don't know is that our neighbor to the north, which would become the country of Canada after the war, I believe in 1867, Canada actually became a country, so it was not quite a country yet at the point of the Civil War. So some areas of Canada were starting to take sides, or what would become Canada anyhow. And at least some of the area that would become the province of Quebec was siding with the Confederates. Now, I'm not sure exactly the reason. Possibly it may have been that a lot of French Canadians had connections with some of the French in the South, like Louisiana and other parts, or there may have been some other reason. But whatever the reason, there were factions of Confederate soldiers up in Quebec in some of these areas that were sympathetic to their cause. And these Confederates conducted a lot of border raids from the protection of the Quebec side of the Canadian border. So one such raid happened in October of 1864 near the border town of Saint Albans, Vermont. And in the wee hours of the morning on October 18th of 1864, a group of about 25 Confederate soldiers who were camped at the Lake Champlain, Missisquoi Bay on the Quebec side of the Lake Champlain border. So if you know, if you've seen Lake Champlain, most of it borders Vermont and New York, but there is a northern part of it that actually exists up in Quebec, and they were camped beside the lake on the Quebec side, not too far from the town of Saint Albans, Vermont. So in the middle of the night, they saddled up their horses and they rode quietly south into Vermont. So these soldiers were led by Captain Bennett H. Young, and they were destined for Saint Albans, Vermont. And Saint Albans also sits near Lake Champlain, about 20 miles south of the international border. And at that time, it was a smaller village. And by this time in 1864, things weren't looking very good for the South, and they were in desperate need for more funds and a final push for the war effort. So Captain Young had received some coded messages on October 15th, a couple days prior, that let him know that there had been a large deposit of $200,000 in gold coins deposited into 3 Saint Albans banks. So Young was commanded to raid the banks and bring the money back to Canada, where it could then be shipped to Richmond, Virginia, and fund some more of the South's cause and their final push. So as morning rose on October 18th, the soldiers pushed their way into the 3 banks simultaneously and stole that $200,000 in gold that had been just deposited in these banks. So they loaded up the saddlebags and even had some spare horses to load down with gold. The townspeople of Saint Albans, they awoke to the commotion of the Confederates escaping with the gold. And it didn't take too long for the Yankees to come out of their houses and try to defend their village. It was said that the Confederates burned these bank buildings and they fired at people coming out of their houses with guns. So the Yankees were not going to have any of that. And these Yankees, or St. Albans citizens, they arranged a posse to chase the Confederates. And the Confederates got, a good head start. But they didn't plan on a few things. They didn't plan on how heavy these packs were going to be on these horses. And they weren't pack mules, and they weren't used to these heavy loads. And they had already ridden all night to get to St. Albans, and the horses were tiring and slowing very fast. So the horses also were not used to following each other like pack mules that might be tied together or whatever. And this led to some of the horses breaking away from the pack, and then they would need to be chased down because they were carrying gold and they couldn't get away. So they would have to stop and chase after a horse and return it back to the group. And it was said that this happened a couple of times. And it was said there was a couple of times that horses had shed the saddlebags too that were full of the weight because, horses weren't used to this weight and they probably wanted it off of their backs. So kind of poor planning on that part. So when this happened again, and everyone would have to stop and gather up coins that spilled out and try to reload the horses, Captain Young began to be extremely concerned that due to all of this chaos and all the stops that they had to make, that they would not make the Canadian border before the posse caught up with them. He knew they were going to be hot on their heels. So now being only about 2 miles from the Canadian border, it sounds like this is approximate area that the horses may have shed a couple, 2 or 3 more saddlebags. And at this point, the captain decided, these Yankees have to be closing on us pretty fast. And he told, I believe it was about 4 of the soldiers to dig a shallow hole just a little ways off of the trail and bury the saddlebags. And I don't believe they buried all of them. They buried some of them that had been shed off of the horses, and so they dug this trench or this hole. They buried the saddlebags, and then Captain Young spotted a large flat rock nearby, and he ordered the men to place it over the cache that they just buried. And it took all 4 of those men, and they were barely able to lift this big flat rock, and they managed to get it in place over top of the hidden gold. And no sooner had they done this than the posse came riding up as the Confederates were getting back on their horses. And the Confederates at this point, they rode their tired horses as hard as they could, and they did make it across with the remaining funds. So once over the border, they slowed down and they taunted the pursuing St. Albans posse. And I guess to me, I kind of think of, that vision in Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail, where the gentleman is saying, now go away or I shall taunt you another time. And so it seems like it was this type of deal on the border. They thought they were safe, and they were, making motions and things at them. And all of a sudden, the posse did not stop at the border and continued to pursue them. So remember, the Confederates' horses were very tired. They ran all night to St. Albans. Then they were loaded down, and they were being, ridden back to Canada. So, I don't know what it is from Missisquoi Bay down to Saint Albans, but I know it's 20 miles from the border down there. So they may have ridden 30 miles in the night, and then another 20 miles. I mean, it could have easily been 50 miles or something, and the horses were pretty tired at this point. So the posse does not quit pursuing them, and the Confederates were dumbfounded by this, and all of a sudden they were in an unexpected battle, and 3 of the Confederates were killed nearly immediately, and then Captain Young ordered his men to fight, and 10 more Confederates were killed and 11 were captured. It didn't say how big the group of these Yankees or Saint Albans citizens were that had pursued them, but obviously it was quite a few. But 3 of the Confederates did manage to escape, and the rest were accounted for. So these Vermonters, they recovered the saddlebags, and they only found about $80,000 in gold coins, so they knew some of it had to be buried or stashed between their current location and the town of Saint Albans where they came from. So on the way back, they looked on both sides of the trail, and they didn't see any fresh digging anywhere. So none of the captured soldiers were part of the burying detail of 4 soldiers, so they were of no help locating the cache either. So it sounds like as some of the cache might have been buried, there may have been some soldiers chasing after another horse or two, and they weren't paying close attention where the other part was buried. So for weeks, people looked up and down the trail to no avail. They never found anything, and eventually enough time passed that most of the townsfolk forgot the incident. So 4 years later, in Greenville, Mississippi, a former Confederate soldier lay dying in a hospital bed of tuberculosis. And the soldier had possibly a day or maybe only hours to live. So his attending doctor asked him if he had any relatives to notify, and, he was very weak at this point. He was unable to speak. But he handed the doctor a very worn journal from his pocket. And the doctor took it, and he made his rounds to other patients, and when the doctor came back to check on the man again, he was dead. So a week passes, and the doctor finally has an opportunity to look at this journal and was in utter shock at what he read. So it had a detailed account of the Saint Albans, Vermont raid. Everything from the preparations, the raid itself, the aftermath, everything. So it described in great detail the burying of the $120,000 in gold just a few yards off of the Saint Albans Montreal Road, and the placement of a large flat rock over the top of the cache. According to the journal, he was one of the 3 escaped Confederates. So he had rode his horse southwest for 2 weeks, avoiding contact with people until he said his horse would go no more, and then he abandoned it. And then he walked from there and eventually got to the Ohio River, where he was able to hitch rides down the Ohio River and then down the Mississippi River until he finally made it back home to Greenville, Mississippi. So the doctor planned to go to Vermont and to look for the gold, but his post at the hospital just didn't allow him to get away. So he held on to this journal for many years before it was obvious he just would not be able to make it. And he passed it to a friend, and then that friend may not have even opened it, but that friend passed it on to another friend, and eventually it landed in the hands of Hubert Crane in 1908. And he was a resident of Birmingham, Alabama, and he was extremely interested in Civil War history, and he read the diary, and he became obsessed with finding the treasure. So he traveled to Saint Albans, and he checked into a hotel, and he started asking around, and he found there was almost no one around that was alive in 1864 and knew of this event. So the few he found had not participated in the chase of the Confederates and knew no real details. So he went to the library there, and he read some old reports of the event, and he discovered that they pretty much all said the same thing, that the gold was buried somewhere off the Saint Albans Montreal Road, south of the Canadian border, and the amount was said to be about $120,000 that was missing. But with his journal, he had something that the papers didn't. He knew about the large flat rock that was placed over the cache. So one evening, about 2 weeks into his stay in Saint Albans, Hubert Crane was eating dinner at a restaurant there, and he was approached by an old man. And this man had said that in 1868, a gentleman showed up in town with a heavy southern accent and asked the townsfolk a lot of the same questions that Crane had been asking. So 1868, this is 4 years after the initial incident. So this gentleman had rented a horse and a wagon and was seen digging along the Saint Albans Montreal Road, and especially in a grove of pines about 2 miles south of the Canadian border. So the man said that, he was questioned about what he was doing, and he was evasive in his answers, and the townsfolk eventually just thought that maybe he was not all there, and they left him alone. And the old man said he eventually left town with the same tattered clothes and suitcase that he came with. So the old man said that the man was one of the 3 that had escaped the battle, but he didn't say how he knew this. So Crane asked the old man if he would accompany him to the woods about 18 miles north of St. Albans to possibly help him find this pine grove. And Crane planned to perform a giant grid search and use a metal probe to look for that large flat rock in case it was covered in pine needles or other forest debris. So the next day they went to the area and they discovered that a forest fire had burned the whole area pretty recently, and there were really no trees left right in that area. So it was no longer possible to find the pine grove or even an approximate area for the treasure, and the old man was then of no help pinpointing the area either. And as far as we know, that $120,000 in gold coins is still there, and it may be worth millions today. So it may still be there underneath a big, large, flat rock that takes about 4 people to be able to move it. And that is the story of the Confederate raid on Saint Albans, Vermont, that resulted in a buried treasure of gold coins in northern Vermont.